Welcome. Episode number 38 of the Tom, Stu and You podcast coming right at you. Tom, how are we doing, my man?
Episode 38. I'm good, thanks, man. How are you?
Good.
What are we going to be chatting about today?
Well, in light of the current US election shit show that's currently going on, the protests that have been happening throughout the year, and with many other elections happening all around the world right now, we thought it would be a good time to discuss the concept of democracy that so many of us take for granted, and which there is plenty to discuss.
There is plenty to discuss, isn't there? It's a bit of a minefield. So this is going to be kind of sort of pondering as we go, and we'll see like what rabbit holes we go down and what tangents we go off on, because I'm sure there's plenty. Sure. I'm sure there's plenty to explore. Democracy is something that I've thought about quite often actually. For a long time, I think it's been part of the reason for it is because every time that I've voted in elections or anything like that, I've personally felt completely disenfranchised and like I've never been represented. That's the curse of having lived in conservative Tory strongholds for most of my life. I don't know why I seek them out. It's just
as an Australian, I understand.
Yeah. And just I think that it's interesting to look at democracy, especially when you look at like the British and American systems, to really look at it, because it's often politicians talk about it all the time, like we need to protect our democracy, and our democracy is what makes us great and bastions of freedom in the world. But I think when you look at it a little bit deeper, and you look at the economic system that exists simultaneously or side by side with a seemingly democratic political sphere, it's quite interesting to observe that I think that there are certainly limitations to it, and there's arguments to suggest that it is more of a sort of managed democracy in the interests of big business and wealth and things like that, and I'm sure we'll explore the reasons for that. And then I think basically what we want to come on to is an exploration of the democratization of the workplace and the other spheres of life apart from the political sphere. It's something that we've touched on in previous episodes. So I guess it's one of the reasons why we just wanted to, touch on democracy in general in this episode.
I imagine there's some of our listeners already out there thinking, for Christ's sake, these guys have attacked capitalism on every episode. They're promoting socialism. We attack pretty much any sort of just standard foundation of society that people believe, just should exist. And now we're about to go after democracy as well. But I just want to point out we're not saying democracy is bad. Yeah. Just to start the episode off on the right point. It's good. We just think there's a better way, as we usually do in these episodes. So I guess we should probably start with what is democracy, which seems like a very simple question that everyone thinks they probably know the answer to. But just to explain, the concept of democracy is that it's a form of government whereby the power is granted to the people. It comes from ancient Greece and literally translates to the rule by the people. Democracy is widely considered to be the best form of government we can realistically have at the moment, but there are plenty of areas of discussion and criticism, as we've just said, and it's largely centered around the implementation of the ideals of democracy and what that actually looks like in today's society. Because at its theoretical basis, democracy is incredible. It protects individual rights, gives equality to all, provides a separation of power between the administration and judiciary aspects of society, creates better opportunities in life, and creates freedom in life. These democratic ideals are why wars have been fought, why kings and queens are almost obsolete, and have now become such an integral foundation for society that to consider anything else seems almost crazy. So in this episode, we won't be discussing why democracy is bad. If anything, we're recommending it to be implemented in more spaces within our society. But we will be mentioning some of the defects in the democratic system and how that is affecting our ability to make the changes required to save humanity. And that is why this episode is so important.
Basically, yeah. So it's really important what you alluded to just there is that we're not saying that democracy is a bad thing at all. We're actually saying that what we feel we need is proper democracy. In essence, for myriad reasons that I'm sure we'll come on to. You mentioned ancient Greece there, so there's probably a good place to start. With Aristotle.
Hit me with some history facts. Yeah.
We're going to do a little comparison, I suppose, of Aristotle's take on democracy and Madison's, take on democracy, one of the founding fathers who was president at the, Constitutional Convention in the US, because they're quite different.
And Aristotle, for all of those non-history buffs amongst our listeners, was one of the most predominant philosophers of all time, from ancient Greece, which is the founding of democracy as a ideology and concept of governing.
Yeah.
He's a pretty important guy.
He's a pretty important guy. He is where, concepts of democracy do come from. And he had the view that democracy should really be about being fully participatory for those who were considered eligible in that time. So it obviously excluded women and slaves and people like that.
Yeah, but ignoring that part of things. Yeah.
Ignoring that part, if you were to apply that concept, to the values that we have today, where we think, everyone should be involved, and, it should even be extended, in my opinion, to people the age of 16 and things like that. As soon as you become part of the workforce or anything like that, I personally feel that you should have a say in, the political life, but also in terms of your working life, the economic sphere, which we'll come on to.
I think that'll be a topic for another day.
Yeah, well,
lowering the voting age, because that is an interesting topic there's lots to discuss.
Yeah. Well, I just think if you are working and paying taxes, you should definitely have a say on where those things go. It's just that simple. So he took it for granted that it should be fully participatory and that it should aim for the common good. He felt that if you had extremes of poor and rich, inequality and things like that, you couldn't really talk seriously about having a democracy, because in a true democracy, you would see, the majority of the poor would get together and take away, the land of the rich or the belongings of the rich and things like that, and seek a more equitable distribution of wealth and things like that. And obviously,
tax the rich.
In order to ameliorate that, though, Aristotle came up with what would basically today be considered to be the welfare state. So you would have a good welfare state, which would aim at reducing, inequality and things like that. So you kind of keep people happy. You give them a value of life, a quality of life that is sustainable and that people would be happy about.
I.e. socialism.
Well, yeah. Well, that's what I would argue for, certainly. So yeah. And, it's notable that today, if Aristotle was alive, and this is something that Chomsky notes, it's like he would probably be denounced as some sort of radical, because we have politicians who are advocates of austerity and things like that, and cuts to public budgets and not feeding
children in need,
not feeding children, but spending
over the holidays. Who would do that? Definitely not the British government right now.
Who would do that? Who would do that? It's unthinkable. It's unconscionable, in fact. But yeah, there you have it. Like that's a great example. Like not feeding. I think the majority of the people would consider that to be a good thing to do.
Yeah.
And this is something we'll come on to as well. There's a divergence between public opinion and public policy in the democracies that we seem to have, which is interesting in and of itself. So yeah, Aristotle, makes the point that it should really be about reducing poverty and creating some sort of welfare state, a good quality of life. You contrast that with James Madison's view on democracy, who's like one of the founding fathers, as I said. So in terms of history, it's not that long ago.
No, not compared to Aristotle.
Exactly. It's the foundation of the American system that we have today. Madison's idea was to reduce democracy instead. And so they did that in a number of ways. So back in the day, when the House of Representatives and the Senate was formed, the Senate was unelected and it was reserved for the wealthy, because they felt that, the wealthy, those who owned things should be, the ones who made the decisions. They were the most well-educated, things like that. He considered that the role of the government was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And so there's a real difference there in terms of the way they look at things. One is about, reducing democracy and, going after things that divide people. So that's another way that you do it, is you divide and conquer against, lines of class, of race and things like that, which we know about has happened in America. Or you try and have a true democracy, like Aristotle's way, where you create a welfare state and actually have fully participatory democracy.
So it really comes down to two sort of primal assumptions.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one assumption, a difference in assumption as to what constitutes the people that a democracy should be protecting and working for. And that's whether or not you believe that democracy should work for all in an equitable and fair state, or should it just be protecting those that have shown through some sort of ability, in quotation marks, because usually success in a capitalist society is built upon some sort of, pre-existing or additional help, some sort of unjust and unfair competitive advantage. Whether or not it should be protecting those, so i.e. the people that own the country, as Madison said, was because they owned the businesses, they owned the property, and
which often come about through means such as slavery as well, which is interesting to know where the wealth has originally come from. Because I kind of think that's an important thing to, how we spoke about history in a previous podcast, and we were like, we need to recognize that the effects that happen, the things that happened in history do ripple through time and have an effect into the present day. And I definitely think that that's something that needs to be thought about in terms of reconciliation, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen, and support. And also just in terms of reconciliation and reconciliating the patrimonial capitalism and inherited wealth that comes from that, and being able to manage the system, as we'll come on to look at.
Yeah, so I guess just before we talk about capitalism, which is our favourite topic to discuss on this podcast, obviously, the two ways, I guess, that democracy has been interpreted and then implemented, I guess, is that in ancient Greece it was a direct democracy. So that means that everyone in society, and by everyone, obviously we have to think about this in terms of like what the ancient Greeks believed, in that everyone they believed was only Greek citizens, and that only included men of a certain social standing. It didn't include the slaves, it didn't include the women. So ignoring that sort of, that difference in the value in society that those sort of segments of the population represented, direct democracy in ancient Greece meant that any of the citizens of Greece could be nominated for office, and therefore could, be given the power, I guess, to represent the people that voted for them. Now, that's obviously very different to the way that it's been implemented in today's society, is that we currently have a representative democracy, in that we vote for representatives who are supposed to represent our values, beliefs, and opinions in Parliament, and vote on issues that, we care about. And because we care about them and we vote for someone, they should also then care about it. And I guess, as we'll touch on very shortly, that ideal of representative democracy hasn't quite been implemented in a way that perhaps we naively and optimistically think it has been implemented. And so while Aristotle, represents through his concept of the welfare state and alleviating poverty, the direct democracy way of implementation, Madison is really focused on representative democracy, in which only the representatives matter, and it's been given to, and the power has been given to a more capable set of men, as he said, and, they became more capable because they hold the wealth of the nation. They're more capable because they're career politicians, as it is now. So it's not that anyone can be voted into Parliament. Only the people getting voted into Parliament are those that are considered capable, those that fit within the restrictions of a representative democracy, and those with the money to be able to afford to then fit into the very narrow set of standards that we've just all come to accept from the way democracy works in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we do talk about capitalism at some length on this podcast, but it is important to do so because it affects so many things.
We should just rename this podcast just "Fuck Capitalism."
I democratically vote yes to that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Majority rules.
Yeah. There we go then. But it is important to bring it up because obviously, in terms of our economic ideology in the West, so in the US and in the UK and things like that, we are capitalist states.
And I guess the big question that I have for you, because I know you're about to go into this, is can you have a capitalist democracy?
Well, this is the big question. If you accept the interpretation of democracy that we've just given based on Aristotle, where participation is fully participatory, people are seen as equals and things like that. I don't see how you can fit the two together. I don't see how you can fit capitalism with democracy, because, as we all know, capitalism is based on hierarchical structures, namely the employer-employee relationship, where the employee is subordinated underneath the employer, and it's based on exploitation of the surplus that the employee produces. If you want, there are shareholders out there who vote for the board of directors, who then appoint the employees and things like that, and shareholders who receive the dividends and things like that don't know anything that goes on in the actual corporation or company, or even contribute to the production of the value. They just reap the value. So that's.
We've lost Tom again.
Sorry about that. My internet sucks. Where was I? So I was talking about capitalism and how it is inconsistent with any notion of democracy. So how is it that we have capitalist democracy? Capitalism is about subordination, exploitation, extraction, destruction of the environment, and things like that. It's a system where shareholders are collecting dividends for doing nothing. So in that system, there has to be people in the system being productive who aren't getting what they're supposed to be getting, or they're not getting, what they're putting into it, basically. So in a sense, you are being ripped off in that situation, and you're not getting the fruits of your labor, essentially. The only reason why a capitalist will employ you for $20 an hour is if in that hour you produce more than $20 an hour. That's the only way that it's profitable, because there's the emphasis on the profit motive and things like that. And so this is why I am an advocate of democratizing the economic sphere of life, democratizing the workplace. Because, say, if I was to disenfranchise you and take away your vote in the political sphere, you would obviously be in opposition to that. There'd be uproar, basically. So how has it come to transpire that in our daily lives as adults, for the most part, for those who are employees of companies, have we agreed to kind of rent ourselves and leave our freedom, or leave our choice, leave our democratic choice at the door of the places where we work? It's a place where you spend most of your hours as an adult, 5 days a week, 9 to 5, whatever it is. And I think you should clearly have, in my view, more of a say about what goes on in that institution, and this is why I think it's important to talk about democracy and capitalism, and whether they are consistent, and whether we should democratize the workplace, because I think it would lead to very different society if we did that. Some of the criticisms of the democratic process, which I'm sure we'll come on to in due course, I think could be remedied by democratizing the economic sphere of life. One of them, just to touch upon them now, is look at the cost of elections forces politicians into the pockets of those with money, those with influence. I think that the donorship of the Tory party in the UK is such a tiny pool of people that when they eventually get elected, they represent just the interests of big business. And I think you can see that quite clearly, quite transparent today, with the just sheer cronyism that there is going on in the UK at the moment. They're using the veil of the coronavirus and the emergency to bypass needs to put contracts out to tender, and they're just giving them to their friends without competition, giving them to companies who have not been trading for all that long, giving them to companies who have links to members of the cabinet or Dominic Cummings or, advisors and things like that. Think tanks that fund the Conservative Party, or certainly, create policy that they then take on board and enact into legislation. So it's really important to think about democratizing the workplace. And I think it's personally something that, people should seriously think about. If the economy has been shifted in a number of ways since the 1970s, since, you have Reaganomics and Thatcher and stuff like that. It's more neoliberal in nature. There's been an increased emphasis on financial institutions, like we've seen that with, the banking sector and things like that. The crash of 2008, the fact that every president since Reagan has bailed out the banks in some way. And also we have obviously increased globalization as well, which puts workers, the working class, in competition with exploited workers across the world. But you'd notice in that, again, a nod to the bullshit jobs, that the more well-paid managerial workers are protected against that kind of competition. That doesn't exist for them. And so in that system, if you had a democratized workplace, do you think that workers would vote democratically to outsource their jobs abroad and make themselves unemployed? Do you think that they would vote to, cut safety standards in food, in production, in whatever? For example, the Boeing company, they cut corners on the safety to do with a certain type of aircraft, and it crashed and killed people. In terms of Volkswagen, they manipulated a test to pass diesel emissions and things like that, polluting the environment further. And that's obviously not good for people who have or anyone, just asthma or anything like that, but just anyone in general. I don't think that people would vote to do that. And that's why I think the democratization of the workplace is a good idea.
I'm forever impressed by your passion for all of this sort of stuff. I just want people to know that monologue that Tom just went off is completely unprepared and just off the top of his head. Tom's not reading from a script right now. This is just something that he thinks about all the time, and he is just able to put it quite well into words like that. But
quite well.
quite well. What I want to do now, briefly, is to provide some context for what Tom is saying, because I know personally, and I know that a lot of people listening won't have the same sort of background information that Tom has. So let's start firstly. What is democracy in the workplace? What are we actually talking about here? And, this could be a much larger topic for discussion that we will probably get to in another podcast episode, because that's what we do. But democracy in the workplace simply refers to allowing employees greater participation in the decisions that affect them at work. So there's a few slightly different approaches to implementing this idea, but it's largely understood to mean that workplace democracy includes things like voting systems, systems of appeal, improved accountability for management, and a democratic socialism, which, as far as Tom and I are concerned, is the ideal, what we're aiming for, the equal share of profits among the workers who actually create the value of the company. So, there's quite a few benefits that researchers have come up with when studying democracy in the workplace, and it's things like greater participation and a stronger voice at work are linked with greater motivation at work. There's greater belief in the values of the organization, and because of that, there's improved productivity and therefore results in the company. So the company actually does better when people feel like they have a voice at work. They feel like their concerns are being heard, and they get some sort of choice in the direction that the company takes. Employee satisfaction is then also improved, and this results in less turnover at work. It means there's less cost for the company, and there's less time and effort needed in human resources. And then lastly, like there's greater accountability of management results in a more equal workplace, and it even leads to greater environmental and social considerations in decision making, as decisions are no longer being made purely for the benefit of increasing the profit for shareholders who aren't involved in the running of the business, and they aren't actually creating the value that the business turns out. Because it's also now dependent on addressing the values and the beliefs held by the employee. So what Tom was mentioning before, this little context in intro that I have just led us on, is that people want to feel like they're making a difference at work. We all have beliefs, opinions, values, and a lot of them can cover things like environmental sustainability, workers' rights, not mistreating employees, not cutting corners, not risking health and safety measures, just trying to cut costs. We as in like the workforce, we as in the working group, we have these values, and because of the way our business is set up, that doesn't matter. We don't really get a choice. We mentioned this in the previous episode. We don't really get a choice a lot of the times when it comes down to the work that we do and how we do that work, because either you do it or the boss fires you. There's very little chance of for employees to get together to discuss, the way work is being done, let alone what work is even being done. And so what democracy in the workplace aims to do is to increase participation and to bring power back to the employees, so that those actually creating the value that the business then can send out, can sell, actually have a say in the way that the business is run and why the business is run. Now, obviously, the challenge of this and the reason why it's not popular is because current policies within workplaces around the world are largely focused on reducing the voice of employees, and even unions, which is, a sort of precursor to democracy at work, struggling to maintain their locus of control. And as in politics, so too it is within the workplace. Sharing power isn't easy, and that's exactly what democracy in the workplace is trying to do. By installing measures aimed at greater accountability and oversight of management, increasing the power of the employees, and decreasing the power of shareholders and the bosses, the management, democracy at work challenges the power of those currently wielding it. And as we all know, if you've got the power, you're not exactly about to give it up willy-nilly.
Yeah, exactly. I think you touched on a lot of good points there, especially with like trade unions and things like that. It's an important point to bring up, and one that I might have missed out. But certainly, I don't think anyone can deny that trade unions are a democratizing feature of society as we currently have it, as a precursor to potentially democratizing the workplace. And it's interesting to note that since we've had a neoliberal economic policy coming from the US and the UK, through Reagan and Thatcher, that the trade unions have been smashed. Like Thatcher was famous for doing that, for reducing the impact of that. Reagan, in fact, America is so poor in terms of trade union membership, it's crazy. And they're supposed to be a democratic country. They're supposed to be like the bastion of freedom
the king
and democracy.
of democracy, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're supposed
the
to
birthplace of modern
ideals.
Democracy. Yeah, it's bullshit.
Exactly. And Reagan was like, in the 70s, if people don't report for work, then they, within 48 hours or something, they forfeit their jobs. And so the spectre of unemployment is a huge plus for the capitalist class, for the corporate elite, because if you can hold the spectre of unemployment over people so that they can't get the necessities of life, and there's, again, as we've said, the reduction of democracy and
Tom's internet is atrocious.
It's terrible.
Terrible.
Isn't it? Why? What's happening now?
I don't know. All right, keep going, man. You're back.
Is it all right? Yeah. So what was I saying? So yeah, the trade unions have been bashed by Reagan and Thatcher, and the spectre of unemployment is something that keeps the working class precarious and perhaps unwilling to associate with trade unions, perhaps unwilling to stand up and ask for better wages, better employment conditions, better pay, better support, things like that, because the capitalist class know that they can just get rid of you, and there's a load of other people who are unemployed or precarious ready to fill that role. That doesn't sound very democratic to me. It sounds like a system of exploitation. So democratizing the workplace, I think, also leads to, by definition, a democratization of the politics, because the political sphere of life, in my view, has been consumed by the economic sphere of life. And you can see that in the skyrocketing cost of elections in the US. I think I quickly Googled how much have been spent or is predicted to be spent on the 2020 election between Biden and Trump. And I think they're projecting like 11 billion. It's supposed to be the most expensive political campaign in history. Which is, again, another thing, if you want us to talk about democracy, is like, how is a working person supposed to compete? If we say anyone can be president of the United States, Sanders had a very good campaign where he relied on small donations from a lot of people. And I really like that campaign, because that's how it should be, because he didn't want to be, in a position whereby he would have to be forced into the pockets of big business or anything like that. And then if you accept that concentration of wealth yields concentration of political power, which I think is quite evident for anyone to see, then if you democratize the economic sphere of life so that the economic sphere of life is more democratic, then you're going to democratize the politics.
Yeah, and I think just to expand on that a little bit, utilizing democratic processes in the workplace can also act as an encouragement for greater public participation in the political process of the country. So it's not even just like, if we democratize the economic sphere, then we democratize more the political sphere. It's that you're actually encouraged to and motivated to participate more in the public political process of the country. Workers develop skills, a greater concern for the common good, and they have more respect for their fellow associates in the workplace, and therefore more respect for their fellow associates in their country, which then transfers to improved citizenship and results in a better functioning democracy. There's very few downsides to democracy in the workplace. The only downside is we have to take power away from those in charge right now. And so it's getting over that hurdle first that then starts a snowball effect where all of a sudden democracy becomes way more important, and then you see democracy in the political sphere as it was intended, as it is designed, and not the current implementation of democracy that we currently see now that has quite a few defects, which we're about to go into now, and that all starts with voting.
Yeah, voting. So
voting systems, Tom, hit me. We've talked a lot about first past the post versus representative, minority ruling. UK, Australia, America all have very similar systems.
Yeah, they do. They all have a first past the post system.
Yep.
I've always been dubious of and critical of first past the post systems.
Can you give us just a very quick summary as to what that is for people who haven't listened to episode number 2 or 3? It was number 2. Maybe?
Basically, they result in things like minority rule. So you can have a political party. For example, the Conservatives just in 2019 won just 43.6% of the votes in general, but they've got a huge majority in the House of Commons. So, talk about people feeling disenfranchised. There's clearly a lot of votes there that aren't being represented.
It's become less who you vote for and more about where you vote for who. So in a first past the post system, basically what's happening is that votes in one particular aspect of the country mean more than votes in another aspect of the country because of the ridings, as Americans call it, because of the where the seats are controlled, I guess, as it were. So, as long as enough people vote for individuals within specific seats, then a political party can get more seats that represents more power than the actual number of people in total who voted for them.
Exactly.
And we saw that with Trump in the last election, is that he actually got less of the public vote, but because he won more seats in key areas, his party, the Republicans, and himself, obviously were able to win the election.
Yeah. That's a functioning of the electoral college that they have in America as well. So it doesn't matter if you win, the popular vote as Hillary did in 2016. More emphasis is given to almost states that have kind of less of a population, but they still have a lot of seats to give, kind of thing. And the electoral college could actually work, and does in a couple of states. I think Maine's one of them, but could work in the sense that they could give so many seats to Hillary and so many to Trump. But I think most of the states just follow a winner takes all. So the winner just gets all of the seats, when that's not really how it should work.
And there's a similar, if slightly different process in Australia or in the UK, where, again, it doesn't matter what the public vote for. It doesn't matter if someone in New South Wales, for example, gets 80% of the vote if they get only 20% of the vote in Queensland, and then the other way around. It all comes down to how many seats you can win, as opposed to percentage-wise on a total scale across the whole country, who's getting the most votes.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of limits political diversity in a way, if it sort of suppresses it. Because, for example, in the 2019 election here in the UK, the Green Party, the Liberal Democrats, and the Brexit Party together received 16% of the vote, yet they shared just 2% of the seats.
Yeah.
So that, to me, doesn't scream democracy, to be honest.
Well, it's not representative of the people's will, is it? It's representative of politicians and political parties, but it's not representative of the ideals that democracy is aiming to uphold.
Exactly, yeah. So then, obviously, you end up in a position with, like the Tories with a majority now, and it's more short-sighted politics, where it's like it kind of is in America as well, like it's every 4 years. Mainly getting elected is about bashing the other side rather than coming up with like constructive policy for the future, like a future vision. Whereas if you had that sort of thing where you had to, like a PR system where you had to create consensus through science, through debate, through reaching out and making agreement with people, through more intelligent and respectful debate, rather than, if I don't know if you've ever seen PMQs in the UK, it's a shit show most of the time, where they're all just like, just all droning at each other, and it doesn't appear that anything productive is happening whatsoever. And I think you could see that in the policy that comes out of the government, to be honest.
And there's a few reasons why this is all happening. I think I just want to maybe clear this up a bit. First is that the reason why this is important is because in majority rules, which is basically how elections are being held in most of the democratic countries around the world, the majority wins, right? And the minority loses. So it's the majority party, they get all of the choice, they get all of the power, they get all of the decision making. Minority loses, 4 years later, you get a chance to do it again, right? When realistically, the public isn't that clear cut. Why should a party with 51% in a majority rules, 51%, then get to make all of the decisions and have all of the power for the next 4 years, when realistically 51% of the population isn't going to agree totally with everything they are talking about? And it doesn't allow for any sort of long-term thinking, because they're only thinking about their election cycle, and then they're, not even that, half of their election cycle, because in the second half of their election cycle, it's all about appeasing the people with money, appeasing the public as much as possible, so that then they get elected, for the next term. So because of that, it creates this short-sighted confrontational politics that you're talking about, where the most important thing is to get voted in with a majority, so that then you have power to do something. Because at the moment, minority governments can't do anything because of this confrontational politics. They can't make any actual decisions. So there is a fine line to play between, having enough power to make the changes necessary, while also not being so competitive that you're just bashing the other side to get power. And the way that the way that is being suggested to us by people who are much more intelligent than you or I is that we need to have this sort of proportional representation way of governance, where everything is about coming together and making the right choice based on the issue at hand. It doesn't have anything to do with having to vote in political party lines, because that's the other big issue, is that anyone who steps out of line with their political party is all of a sudden made to be the bad guy. When, in a representative government, the way it should be set up, the way we think it is set up, is that when we vote for a representative from our local area, they should be voting on the issues and the items that affect the people in their constituency. Representative. They're supposed to represent our beliefs, opinions, and values. And yet, for some reason, we've just become okay with giving up most of our own personal beliefs, opinions, and values for a political party that, while we might agree with on most of the issues, of course, I'm not going to agree with them on everything. That's not the way human beings work. That's not the way that we're designed. And yet, for some reason, we've just accepted the fact that our democracy is broken by using this majority rules, first past the post, short-sighted, confrontational political structure, and we're not demanding accountability from our representatives.
Yeah. Certainly something you said there is absolutely true.
Just something.
Basically, no, sorry. Everything you said is true, but like something is stuck in my head from what you just said is that a lot of the representatives that we have don't actually represent who they are elected by. So the population is almost marginalized by the current system. And you can see that if you just look at public policy that's made by a government versus the public opinion, which is quite an easy comparative analysis to make. In fact, an academic called Martin Gilens studied this in the US and found that I think it's like the bottom 70% of the population are quite literally disenfranchised in America.
Yeah.
They might the elected representatives don't pay attention to any of them. But they did find in that same study that it indicated that the analysis that they undertook indicated that economic elites and organized group representing, business interests and things like that had quite a big impact, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups had little or no independent influence whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So again, that's a nod back to capitalism and the concentration of wealth yielding the concentration of political power that you see.
Yeah, I mean, you're not gonna be elected if you can't afford to even run, right? You're not going to be elected if you can't afford to campaign. And so when someone with money tells you to do something, you either bend to their will or you don't get elected because, the power of people isn't enough, despite the fact that that is what democracy should allow for. It really comes down to who has the money to be able to run for campaigning. And then especially we talk about the US a lot, and despite the fact that neither of us are US citizens, we talk about the US because it is sort of like a very extreme level of everything we're talking about, especially in relation to democracy, in that so many of the issues facing democracy are that much more apparent, that much more visible in America. But that's not to say that these same issues don't also exist in Australia and the UK. They're just usually a bit more hidden, a bit more behind the curtain. They're not quite as extreme. There isn't quite as much money in our economies as there is in the States. So don't just disregard anything we talk about as soon as we mention the United States. Actually have a think about how might this also be playing a role in the way that democracy is working in your own country.
And I'd just like to take a moment to just bring attention to the kind of voter suppression that's going on in the US. I know it's always gone on.
Yeah.
But some of it is really quite. They have the voting system of a third world country. It seems to be such a task to go and vote in America. They have ID laws, 10-hour waits or like waits for hours. So how, as a working person who doesn't get a day off to go and exercise the vote or anything like that, are you supposed to fit that into your working day? And that's before any sort of child care commitments that you might have or anything like that. Any illness that you might have. We spoke when we spoke to Mitch about their insurance system for medical care, and this is supposed to be, and you said we do focus on America, and we do. It's because it's like this is supposed to be, it holds itself up to be the place of freedom, of democracy, and things like that, and it just doesn't appear to be satisfying that at all. You have people who have to do long drives to go and vote. There are electoral roll purges by the counties, so you can be thrown off the register, and then you have to go through the whole process of re-registering to vote. Obviously, there's a ban on like convicts and stuff like that. So we spoke about that before, when we were talking about the defund the police episode, how a lot of the time, African American life and minority life has been criminalized, which is another thing, and quite sinister, I think, if they've been criminalized for something like marijuana possession, and now in a number of states that's becoming quite a profitable capitalist venture for
For white guys,
yeah. White guys, basically. It really is amazing. And so a lot of the elections especially in the US, are kind of engineered in a sense, because, as we said, politicians have to go into the pockets of big business to get the funding to be able to go on these political campaigns that you could never do if you were like a working class person. How are you supposed to take time off to travel the country and persuade people of your policy? So it seems to be a realm that's confined to wealthy families like Clintons and Bushes and things like that, or millionaires like Bloomberg. So the office of the presidency seems to be almost inaccessible to just the regular people, even though it's part of the American dream that is expounded by politicians. It's similarly in the UK. A lot of the prime ministers we've had all come from Eton and go to Oxbridge and all these fantastic schools. They come from families of wealth and inherited wealth, and so it's the same thing. Like you say, the comparative analysis that can be made and extrapolated from just looking at the US to other capitalist countries like the UK. I have looked at this and thought about this for quite a while, but I do think it's quite transparent when you start to look for it. And just things like, let's go for Citizens United, and just the fact that corporations, this is one of the things I really struggled with, and maybe where it kind of started for me with this was at university. During company law, we were learning about the separate entity principle with companies and how they've got the same rights as human beings. They're in fact superhumans in a sense. And the case in the 1970s called Buckley and Vallejo in the United States, Supreme Court case, equated money to free speech. So money is a form of free speech in America. And then you go, years later on to 2009, 2010, Citizens United case comes along, and freedom of speech can't be curtailed for corporations. So corporations can spend what they like on political campaigning. And do you think that they just do that out of the goodness of their heart and they don't expect, favourable legislation, favourable tax breaks, things like that? I think if you think that's the case, then that's kind of a dream that you live in. So this brings me kind of onto the concept of inverted totalitarianism, which is a term coined by an American political economic philosopher called Sheldon Wolin, who noted that in America, and by extension from what we're talking about, the UK and places like that, you can't really point to any national institutions and accurately describe them as being democratic anymore, because they're highly managed. You've got money-saturated elections, as I just said. Congress is infested by lobbyists and interested parties of big business. The presidency is like imperial in nature. There's a class-biased judicial and penal system, as we've talked about previously on the podcast, and the media is not that independent at all. You see that in the US with CNN and Fox and things like that. In the UK, media the mass media ownership is such a small group of people that then they can manipulate people and manufacture consent for these certain ideals. So a big one at the moment is like scapegoating immigrants, people who are seeking a better opportunity, a better life for their families. The quote, no one goes in the water unless it's safer than the land, I think is true.
Yeah.
It's obviously true. And it stops people from, it's that whole divide and conquer thing. And why we don't have a democracy is because like it stops people from looking at the people trying to cross the channel and drowning in the channel and going, they're like me, really.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're of the same class. It stops you from looking upwards at, you know, people who've got wealth and corporate power and things like that. And also note here as well that capital is not constrained by borders. Like Amazon is still, you know, sucking money out of our economy and not paying any tax, sucking money out of the American economy and not paying any federal tax. But we're concerned with like a few people trying to get over to make a better life. It really doesn't make any sense to me. So it kind of stops that class solidarity that needs to be there, and those democratizing tendencies that we've spoke about. So yeah, I think that it's important to democratize the other areas of life rather than just the politics, because it's kind of a facade, as you know, going back to the inverted totalitarianism. So our system is not totalitarian in the sense that it has a demagogue, or, well, maybe Trump, you could argue, is some sort of demagogue or a charismatic leader. But it finds its power in the anonymity of the corporate state. So corporations, you know, they buy politicians, essentially. They buy the electoral process, which then results in favourable conditions to boost profits, essentially. Mm-hmm. And you can see that in the increase in inequality that we have in our societies. You can see that in the precarity of people, the working people on a daily basis. There's so many people on 0 hours contracts, you know, working paycheck to paycheck in America, deciding if they should pay this bill, that bill, the medical bill, the water bill, feeding kids over their own health. It's just, you know, it's quite crazy. So inverted totalitarianism is a concept that I can see. It's the idea that the system pays outwards respect to the appearance of electoral politics, the Constitution in America, civil liberties, you know, freedom of the press, which we've just talked about, you know, an independent judiciary, but look at how politicized the American Supreme Court is. We've just seen that recently.
Yeah.
So you know, traditions, languages of American patriotism, but effectively, like big business, finance, etc., has effectively seized all the mechanisms of power, and the citizen is basically impotent. So it's not a democracy. It is in effect a totalitarian system.
Yeah, it comes back to what I was mentioning much earlier, and that's the concept of predatory competition. And, you know, the existence of defects within our democratic institutions entices the type of person who wishes to exploit those defects to form a large part of the cohort of people vying for political positions. So what I mean is the fact that being a politician now is a career choice in and of itself means that already they're not part of the working class who they're supposedly representing. It already means they aren't living a life that would align them with the values and opinions and beliefs of the people that apparently representing. And it encourages them to then reach for the power that they can see in front of them. You know, capitalism has preyed on our evolutionary need for security, and it's raised it to a level where we now desire more than we could ever hope to need. And competition is now built into every aspect of our society, so it's only natural to expect it in our politics as well. You know, it's precisely because of this competition that we see politicians exploiting their positions of power for their own needs. And that's basically happening now with companies as well. Even if you aren't sending someone from your company to become a politician, it's easier to just buy a politician instead and still get the same results. And so when those sort of defects exist in the political sphere, of course they're going to be exploited. And of course, as I said earlier, those people in power aren't going to be willing to give up their share of power anytime soon. And so there's no incentive for those already in power to then bring about any sort of meaningful change. And a lot of that comes back to us. So it comes back to you and me, individual people, you know, small community organizations. The big challenge facing democracy right now is purely a lack of public education about key issues and the fact that people don't understand anything we're talking about. And even if they did understand it, They don't want to understand it. They have no interest in learning more. And a lot of it comes down to falling confidence in the media. We've traditionally relied on the media to inform the public about key issues, but now with our falling confidence in the media as being an unbiased source of information and a source of knowledge, which is a fair argument to make, as you said. Like it's not unbiased, and it probably never was. But at least now we're seeing the impact of that. And couple that with a failing education system where capitalism forces someone to go into debt to then try to make money to then have the power to pay it back off again. It's just it's a broken system, and
It is.
it's this ignorance or a lack of education, a lack of interest, which creates the opportunity to be exploited by those in power through manipulative media. So whether that's traditional media, personalized Facebook ads, conspiracy websites, or whatever it is, those in power, they know exactly what they're doing. They know how to reach you and I. That's why we've seen such atrocious, just bashing style political ads in every country around the world, because as I said earlier, that's the most important thing. The most important thing is to get the majority, because as soon as you get the majority, you win. And it doesn't matter how you get it, doesn't matter why you get it. As soon as you get that, you win, and your party has power now for the next 4 to 5 years. And so when the system is intentionally designed to give the illusion of equality and instead places all the power in the hands of a minority, how then do we fix it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
the truth is we don't know for sure what a true equitable democracy would look like in terms of real implementation, because it really hasn't been done properly before. Ancient Greece might be a great ideal, and for a romantic we might put that up as the ideal to aim for. But truth be told, it also had a lot of defects in the way that it was run. And you and I, Tom, we're definitely not political experts, and so we aren't able to provide you with all the answers. But we do have a few ideas.
Sure. Yeah. So the main idea, and I think you alluded to it perfectly there, is to democratize the economic sphere of life. And what makes me feel like that amount of trust should be placed in the population, the electorate, or what have you, is that a lot of the rights that we enjoy as people, there are a lot of rights that have been achieved, through the civil rights movement, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, women's suffrage. These didn't get handed down by benevolent masters. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They were agitated for through civil disobedience and all this kind of thing. So the people, the mass of people, the working class, who, as we spoke about before, with feminism and things like that, are rooted in socialist values from the start. And they're the ones who've advocated for these changes, and the rights have come through by making it unconscionable for those in power not to do it. Mm-hmm. The same happened with the New Deal, FDR in the 30s. The trade unions, the working people had to create the environment, the demand for him to put in place, the guaranteed jobs program and the social safety net, social security, things like that. Access to help if you were unemployed and couldn't find a job. So it's this kind of thinking that it's always been the people who've got us to where we are. The rights that we have weren't handed down benevolently, as I said, mm-hmm. by politicians or whatever, because they don't really want to give that freedom. It's not conducive to keeping a capitalist system going to give people these kinds of freedoms. But the people have agitated for them, and that's why I think that democratizing the workplace and even communities and things like that, there's many ways that you could democratize life. You could democratize communities or consumer. You could have democracy within consumer groups and things like that, who actually consult with manufacturers, product developers, all these kinds of things. So there's myriad ways you can do it, but until we do it, I agree with the American thinker John Dewey, who said that until there's democratization of the workplace, then policy will be the shadow cast on society by big business. And I completely agree with that. That links into the concepts of inverted totalitarianism, which we've just spoke about. It links into the idea that, and I think this is undeniable, that the Democrats and the Republicans are both the party of big business in the US. And it's certainly, I think, going much the same in the UK. I think Labour is going more towards the centre again, or the centre-right under Keir Starmer. It's about protecting corporate interests, business interests, rather than the working people, and enabling them to have a say in the system in which they operate. I think once you look at these things, and you alluded to this as well in what you just said, was that I think that sometimes people, once they finish work and all that kind of stuff, they don't want to be thinking about this stuff. It's hard graft, really, to think this stuff through and to do the research and to formulate your own analysis and things like that. And I think there's a reason why, adult education is so poor these days. There's an attack on education anyway. Well, in the UK, the Tories have said that they want to ban any teaching materials that are critical of capitalism. As I said in a few episodes ago, it's like that is totalitarian in nature. It's some form of censorship. So these things are all linking together, but it is hard to put the time aside, especially if you're working paycheck to paycheck. If you have got loads of other stuff going on in your life, if you're just knackered after producing wealth for people who just benefit from your work, I can see how you might not be arsed. And if you feel disenfranchised by the political system, as we've talked about earlier as well, then what's the point? All you're thinking about is surviving, really, and getting day to day.
Yeah. In saying all of that, we do need to do more. I know it's hard, and I know it really sucks, and you don't want to think about this sort of stuff, but we need to actually start thinking about some of this sort of stuff. And even if you're just listening to this podcast and, we have a couple of questions for you and you think about it for 5-10 minutes afterwards, like that is such a good start. And I have sort of 3 little spiels, I guess, as to what I think we should all be doing and pushing for in terms of how do we fix this democracy that we find ourselves in and how do we get better. So maybe I'll say each spiel and then I'll let you respond to each of them, because no doubt you have a brilliant monologue planned. But it starts first.
I really don't.
It starts first and foremost with utilizing as much of our powers within the current state of democracy as we can. And we say this on pretty much every episode, and you can't blame the system that you're in. You have to use the system to break it. And that it seems strange as an Australian, where voting is compulsory for all adults over the age of 18, but in many democracies around the world, voting is a choice. And in these democracies, you must go out and vote whenever the chance arises. Let your voice be heard, convince those around you of the importance of utilizing this freedom, and vote. But also, don't just vote for someone and anyone. Take the time to actually figure out who best represents the interests and values that you care about. Not your parents, not the political party you've just happened to vote for all of your life. What are the values and interests that you care about at this time in your life? And cast your vote for them. Accept that it is our responsibility, at the very least, to be informed enough on the issues that matter. You don't have to have a political education. We don't need to all have a university degree. We don't need to know everything. We just need to inform ourselves enough to be at a level where we feel confident in making a decision to vote on someone that we believe to be most likely to vote in line with our beliefs. We live in a representative democratic society, and therefore we need to make sure that those representatives that we're voting represent us and our beliefs and opinions and values.
Yeah, I mean, so the message there, I guess, in terms of America, is vote for Biden. I mean, and that's not saying that. This is another thing about America at the minute. It's like,
I love temptation.
Is that the best that you can do? You know what
And
I
it's
mean?
not. And it comes back to what we were talking earlier, is that like the people don't actually have that much power. So in the
Mm.
current state of democracy, we don't get to choose who our representatives are. They're chosen for us, and then we just vote on the best of what's given to us. That already
Yeah,
is a reduction in our power. That already is a broken democracy. The fact that we don't
yeah,
have a choice from the get-go means that no way is it ever going to be possible for us to actually truly have a proper representative democracy and a proper
mm.
representative government that fits
I
our
also
beliefs and
think
opinions.
I also think not only that, I actually also think that the office of the presidency is actually quite weak in the system. I don't think that, because once you've, as we talked about earlier, as you get forced into the pockets of corporations and wealthy people, there's not much you can do really.
I mean,
Uh,
Trump's not exactly
once
the
you're in there,
best example of supporting your argument right now, man.
no, but Obama is.
But Obama is, yeah, that's true.
Obama didn't do much for working people really.
Yeah.
But it was all. If you look back at his campaign, which he actually won an award from the advertising industry for, which is interesting. If you want to look at manufacturing consent and all that kind of stuff, it's all just rhetoric about hope and hopey changey stuff. It's not like this is what we're going to do. There's no actual. There could be more in terms of policy. But policy is not what they're selling. They're selling like the hopey changey stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can see that he didn't do much for the people of Detroit when they were getting poisoned by the governor there or whoever it was. Just ridiculous. He did that ridiculous publicity stunt where he just like wet his lips with the poisonous water. It probably wasn't even the poisonous water. So there's a great example. And he didn't really do much for the reason why you get Trump. Trump is a symptom of a failed system, a system that's sick, basically. And so when Obama left office, I think like something like at the bottom 50% of working families couldn't afford the cheapest car on the market. So when you have conditions created like that, when you have someone come in where the hope has been built up and then just doesn't deliver, you will turn to something like Trump. So in a way, it could be interpreted in some way that Trump is a kind of failure of Obama in a lot of senses. But yeah, so I encourage people to think about democratizing the workplace.
Mate, we're not there yet.
I think
Hold up. Jeez, you were jumping way
Well,
ahead. Mate, there's still 2 more spiels to go. We're just talking about go out and vote. Yeah.
Okay,
Democratizing the workplace is coming. Hold up. I told you, he's passionate, man. He's got the script in front of him, and he's already jumping to point 3.
It's just ramblings of a madman.
So despite the fact that we can't choose our representatives at the first level, we don't even get to choose the options that we then vote on. Because of that, we must continue to demand greater transparency and accountability of our elected leaders, and we must continue to respect the right of protest for ensuring that they're acting in the best interest of the people they govern, not the companies and individuals with the money to manipulate them. And so this all comes back down to what Tom was mentioning earlier about, like, most of the change in society has happened because the representatives, even though we voted those representatives in, those representatives didn't actually represent the will of the people. They didn't represent what was important to us as a society then, which is why protest is so important, and it's why this year has been so important. And that's why these protests have continued for longer than they should have done, because in a true democracy, a protest would have only happened for a very brief period of time. It would have been obvious that the will of the people and that the majority supported, Black Lives Matter. Like, why is that such a big issue? It's such a big issue because the representatives, even though we're voting them in, don't represent the will of the people. And so it will take time to change a system to allow greater participation by all in choosing the representatives that lead us. And it will take time to break down the curtains of secrecy that surround political funding and bring about a more equitable democratic process. It all takes time, but we must start and continue the fight as soon and with as much urgency as we can, as all other societal changes are predicated on our ability to do so. So we've seen the ability of companies and their money to manipulate the political elite in ensuring their short-term gains are maintained, even if it's at the detriment of society. And we've seen this with the inaction of governments around the world in facing the climate emergency. 40 years we've known about the effects the human industry is having on our planet. the capitalist machine that is rolling through our world. And yet, despite that knowledge, the allure of profit within the fossil fuel industry and the manipulation that they have maintained in the small cohort of representative officials that we're able to vote in has led us to this moment where we now face the worst outlook at our future of humanity has ever seen.
Yeah, and that's a huge point to bring in to this as well. That does link into democracy, is that based on the science, as we spoke about last week, we don't have long to sort this stuff out.
No.
And if if we do democratize, life in general to include all spheres, then I think people have got the, common sense to go, yeah, maybe, because working people care a lot about their families and stuff like that, and the future of their children. So they're going to go, if you democratize the company like, I don't know, Shell or something, there is the potential to go, maybe we should stop doing this, and maybe we should pay ourselves enough to collectively be able to live and have the necessities of life and, little nice things, but we don't have to pay ourselves like what the executives or the shareholders receive, which is in the order of millions.
Mm-hmm.
Look at how much Jeffrey Bezos has expanded his wealth during this pandemic. Imagine if you could pay everyone that works for Amazon like a really good living wage.
It's $100,000. If Jeff Bezos right now was to give every employee of Amazon $105,000 right now out of his own personal bank account, he would still have as much money as he did before this pandemic hit.
Exactly, right? And then and then people go, yeah, but what are they going to do? Like, say, if you want to change the business model of a company like Shell or something, you go, right, well, look at all that money that we've got access to now, because it's not being hoarded by wealthy people. Mm-hmm. We can use that to invest in R&D, into renewable energy, into new infrastructure, into educational things for our kids to learn about renewable energy. All this is just a story. The way that everything is set up in our economy, it's just a story that could just be told in a different way, and that's all that we need to do. And that's what I feel personally some sort of green socialism is about. It's about democratizing the workplace. It's about democratizing life, which in effect, or has, I believe, the effect of democratizing the political sphere even further.
Yeah. Democracy at work is no longer just a fiction of science research. It is a proven benefit to society for the many reasons that we mentioned earlier. This is my third point, by the way. Tom just segued so nicely into it. We must get comfortable with the idea of democracy within all of aspects of our lives for us to realize that we've been blindfolded by those still clinging to power and led into ignorance towards an idea of freedom and equality when that has never really truly been the case with how democracy has been implemented in society. And let's not get caught up in the argument that at least it's better than a dictatorship or, democracy is the best that we've got. Like, that's such a bullshit get out of jail free card sold to us by those in power. Like, no shit, it's better. But that doesn't mean that you're not still a wolf in sheep's clothing leading us to slaughter. Let's work together to change our society to become what we all believe it to be and what we all desperately want it to be. And it all starts with us, all of it. All of the biggest issues facing humanity, they all come down to us as individual people. We can't afford to remain blissfully ignorant anymore. We can't just say, I don't care about politics, it doesn't interest me, it doesn't affect me, because it most certainly fucking does affect you. It literally affects you every single day. So starting here, start now, take off the blindfold, start paying attention to the world around you, and actively start looking for ways to make the world a better place. Fuck capitalism, let's go. Let's start a green socialist revolution.
Yeah, nice.
Nice.
I do think that is what we need. For sure. And I do think that, as we said, if you trust the people who have agitated for the rights that we have, and don't forget, it is quite a free society. Still, we can say stuff like this, and because of the free. There is, it's quite a free society, but in a lot of ways it isn't. And we can certainly do better. I don't think that this is like, it's fine to say this is the best it's ever been. I don't think it is. I think that the 50s and 60s were much better periods of solidarity and egalitarian society. which shows that there's something better to be achieved than neoliberal capitalism, which, as we've said, destroys the environment, creates huge inequality, creates just places where you can't reach money. Like, you can't get to Jeff Bezos's money, even though we could do so much with it, and he doesn't need it all. It's just it's crazy.
Because that's the other thing. That outrageous statement I say where he could give every employee of Amazon $100,000 on his own personal bank account. You can't say, like, the pandemic happened. It wasn't because he worked harder than someone else. It wasn't because he saw a business opportunity and got himself into a position where he can exploit it. He just happened to run a company that became the most important thing in a pandemic that no one realistically saw happening. And a few people may have seen it happening, but it's not like there were any other businesses around the world just being like, 2020 pandemic's going to happen, we're going to get rich. That money he made isn't value that he has created from himself. And yes, while he should be rewarded for creating a company as amazing as Amazon, amazing if you can say that, as well structured and as popular as Amazon is, like, yes, there is some value in everything he has created. He's not there every day creating value like the individual workers. And so to say that he deserves the extra 20 billion or whatever that he's made during a pandemic while the rest of his staff literally work overtime just to pay bills because they don't have a government that supports them through life and through something like a pandemic which they couldn't have ever possibly predicted and therefore saved for, it's madness.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Tom, your internet is truly atrocious.
I know, it's truly atrocious.
I just had such a wonderful, just like slam dunk on capitalism and the bullshit that is Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, don't worry, because I literally wrote down, as popular as Amazon is, take it away.
Yeah.
That's where you're up to.
Brilliant. But I think we will touch on billionaires and just the outrageousness of that being even a category of person that someone could possibly achieve in a future episode. But all we wanted to really say in this episode is that democracy is very important and it's not currently working the way we all think it is. And if you're in America, go and vote, like, today. Actually, I guess the voting is probably yesterday for Americans coming out now. But, if actually pay attention to the world around you, like, have an interest in politics because it does affect you and it does affect your life. And, we can't create the massive, big societal change that we need without a proper working democracy. And so this is where it all starts. Like, yes, it's amazing to donate to non-profits, but if they can't ever get enough power to actually change public policy and get it put into law, then it's not going to change the world the way we need it to.
Absolutely, yeah. Before we would wrap up as well, I'd just like to draw attention to the work of a investigative journalist in the UK who has written a book called Democracy for Sale. He's called Peter Gagan. He investigates the dark money that there is infiltrating British politics, especially things like the Conservative election last year and the Leave campaign. And he draws attention to the fact that we have antiquated electoral laws which are hardly punitive for breaching electoral spending. So if you breach the electoral spending limits in the UK, I think you get fined like £20,000, which is nothing compared to what they get.
When you're getting funding in the millions, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this money is funneled through think tanks and unincorporated associations and things like that don't have to declare who their donors are, which is really, really a problem for democracy, because as we've seen with Brexit, which is kind of funny but sad at the same time with Brexit, is because people thought that they were taking back control of sovereignty, of democracy with Brexit, but actually you are creating the conditions that were being generated and agitated for by far-right American think tanks and things like that were funneling money into the Vote Leave campaign. So that is really a horrible situation that I think is coming down the road in terms of the UK being in a really weak position on trade negotiations with the US in terms of food standards and pharmaceutical access to the NHS and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a subversion of democracy as well, the dark money that there exists in politics. Also the use of, as we've touched on before in previous episodes, social media and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, the Conservatives changing themselves to Fact Check UK during the general election campaign and debates is, I don't even know how to describe that. You know, creating fake Labour manifestos that people would never agree with.
It's slimy.
It's slimy. And it's an affront to any kind of democratic, you know, institution. Any kind of democratic society, sorry. And so these are things that we really need to keep an eye on. And again, that calls into question the whole, because of the way that social media is used and the power that these silicon tech giants have, they probably need to be democratized as well, is what I'm saying, because there's no accountability whatsoever. Whereas if you have like a democratic system, you have that accountability. This is all about increasing accountability, really.
Yeah.
Which can only be a good thing.
It's all about human dignity as well. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Like this, we are living our lives. Like, why should we not have a say in the way that we live our life? And we think we do, and yet we live in a society where so much of what affects us on a day-to-day basis is completely decided by such a small minority. And we're blindfolded to this fact, and we live in blissful ignorance because it's comforting to think that, you know, we have control of our life. You know, we can make whatever decision we need to do. We get to, you know, we live in Australia, we live in Canada, we live in America, we live in UK. Like, we're so lucky to be able to decide what we really want to do in life. But that's not the case. Like, that's not the way life works. And so to think anything differently is naive, and we don't have that choice anymore.
Yeah, even if you come up with someone who would argue that position, that like this is the best time in history, the best time to be alive or whatever, it's like, yeah, great, okay, make that argument, but it doesn't mean that we stop here. Like, this is the best we can do.
Yeah.
We should always be trying to be better, and more, in my view, more egalitarian, more. You know, we talked about individualism and collectivism and things like that, more together, because society has been atomized in a lot of ways. Just look at America, as a microcosm of like the atomization of people against each other over personalities. Because Trump and Biden aren't talking about policy, really. It's just like a shit show.
Yeah, it's just
as we
pointing
said.
him versus me.
But it's the exact same as what happened in the UK, is that the whole thing became a personality contest rather than looking at, you know, the actual policy. And that is a dangerous road to go down for any kind of notion of democracy. So yeah, thank you for listening, everyone.
Yeah, we could talk about this for a long time.
I could honestly go on about this.
We'll drag it on. We'll just keep rambling if we don't stop now.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you have thoughts,
really
opinions, questions, comments, queries, please do send us an email, hi@tomstewandyou.com. We do love hearing from you. We do love receiving the emails. If you're listening on iTunes, leave us a rating with what you think about our show. If you've been a long time listener, or if you've just joined listening, leave us a rating on your favorite podcasting apps. Like us on social media. It's at Tom Stew and You on Facebook, and Instagram, Twitter. We're now on YouTube, Tom Stew and You, if you want to see our beautiful faces as we tell you to start a revolution, a green socialist revolution, and fuck capitalism. You can see how big our smiles are when we say that. But until next time, we've got a few wonderful guests coming up over the next few weeks, so I'm very excited to see where we're taking this podcast, and as always, we're looking to break your echo chamber. So we're talking about the issues that perhaps you don't think about on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully we make some sort of small impact on you personally, and that's if we change the life of one person and that one person changes the lives of another person, that's all we're looking to do. But have a wonderful week, everybody, and until next time, bye.